we are going to have Nick come and share, but I'm going to introduce you first. And this is a message you can glean from, take from. It's going to be so life-giving to your marriage. So Nick and his wife, Michelle, is going to join us a little bit later in the morning. So Nick and Michelle live in Gresham, Oregon. They have 4 children ranging from 11 to 18 years old. Nick is the executive director of Pure Desire Ministries, a parachurch organization that provides hope, freedom, and healing from sexual brokenness through Jesus Christ. He's the author of 2 books. The first one, Setting Us Free, which is his personal story of healing and redemption. And the next one is called Safe, Creating a Culture of Grace in a Climate of Shame. And they began their own healing journey 13 years ago and have been working with men and women in the area of sexual health, purity, and recovery since that time. Both Nick and Michelle have led small groups of men and women, pointing them toward healing, change, and restored marriages. They are passionately committed to the local church and helping churches become places of authenticity and healing. Prior to working at Pure Desire, Nick was a pastor in an Alliance church for 15 years. He's a certified pastoral sex addiction professional. He's an avid runner, a committed Minnesota Twins fan, and a self-professed coffee snob. Michelle has been in education for over 20 years and is currently the 2nd grade teacher here at Good Shepherd. At home, she's an avid card maker, baker, and kid taxi service. And she dreams of going to Italy. So we're going to first welcome Nick, and then later in the morning, Michelle's going to join us.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much, Maddie and team. Great to be with you. I really appreciate that story of the deer, and would also remind you in that illustration, the one with the antlers are the ones that get shot at. And there may be an application there for men and the pressures they face, but things have a way of balancing out. Great to be with you in person this morning. The last time I got to share with Mom was on video during the COVID era that we all walked through, and that's very different to, I shared to a camera with another guy in the room who was doing the tech stuff, knowing that all these women were going to watch it, and I hope it communicated well, but it is nice to be in the room and get to share on a topic that I think is vitally important to all of us. If we are married, have been married, or plan to be married, the likelihood percentage-wise is even if you're not currently married, at some point in the future you will be. And the joy that can be lost or found in marriage, I think, is unequaled in any other relationship, because our marriage relationship becomes the person in our life who is closest to us, knows us best, and I think therefore carries the capacity to be a part of our greatest joys and highlights, but also carries the potential to be the source of our greatest pain, difficulty, and frustration, all in the same relationship. And that almost feels unfair, but that's marriage. And that's why marriage is messy and complicated and beautiful and awful, all at the same time. And depending which season you are in, you may feel very differently about your marriage this morning. And so I hope what I share is able to give you some ideas and direction. I'm sure that not all of it is applicable to every person, but I think everyone can gather something out of the principles that we have learned. And for us to share those principles, really, as I look at the marriage that we have and that we're working on now, because we are also working on our marriage just like you are on yours. We're not perfect. We have our flaws. We have our struggles. But our marriage really has been divided into 2 parts, in what we would call before Pure Desire and after Pure Desire. And it's not just because I work there. Really, I'd say I work there because it's a byproduct of what it did in our lives and our story, and we just became so passionate about helping people in this area. But it's really the principles that we learned and how it applied to our relationships that became so life-altering. The need for Pure Desire was because of my personal struggle, but the outcome of Pure Desire was far more than just changing a behavior. It really impacted everything about our marriage. And so it would be very, very difficult for me to share about how do you cultivate joy in marriage if you didn't have that backstory on our marriage and what led us through a journey with Pure Desire. So that's what I want to share a little bit of that with you, and then I'm going to unpack some principles of what I think this has led to for us to cultivate joy in our marriage. Then when Michelle is here, I mean, she's right now currently teaching 20 of the second graders here. Maybe some of your children are in the class. And so you can understand how awesome it is that she's also willing in the middle of that day to come and share a little bit with you. But she'll share a bit about our marriage too. And then also the team asked if we'd share some of the principles we've learned about talking with our kids about sex and sexuality, because that's a very difficult subject as well. And the two actually, I think, fit together more than you might expect. So she'll share some more on that, and then we'll have the normal time for questions at the end. Well, our story began at a small Bible college in Minnesota, just outside of the Twin Cities. I was there as a student, as a freshman. I was in a world missions class, and the college visit coordinator walked in that day, she was in my class, but she walked in with this beautiful young woman, and I immediately on the inside just felt something inside of me light up and thought, man, I have got to get to know this girl. And so they ended up sitting in the row right in front of me, and the only way I really knew how to be noticed at that time was to try to be funny. I say try because you could ask my wife, it's debatable if I was successful or not. But I did attempt enough jokes and humor that she noticed me. So whether I was funny or not, the end goal accomplished that she noticed me. We got to talk a little bit that day, and then she was just visiting the college in her senior year of high school. I didn't see her again for several months until we both ended up back at the school in the fall. We began a dating relationship, dated for the next 3 years as we were both getting our college degree there, myself in ministry, her in education. And then towards the beginning of our senior year, or my senior year, her junior year, actually, we ended up both being seniors. I took a year off. That's another story. We could go to that later. But so it was both of our senior years, we got engaged. And at a college chapel, the speaker really encouraged us. He said, when you get married and say, I do, you want the person to know everything they're saying, I do too. And so if there's any part of your life that is secret or unknown to them, you owe it to them to tell them before you're married and not wait and have it be a surprise after. And I thought, well, that makes a lot of sense to me. I want to be transparent. I don't want to have anything that I'm hiding from my future wife. And so that night, after that chapel, we went out on a date. And before we walked into this coffee shop, I, for the first time in our dating relationship of 3 years, opened the door to my private, secret struggle with pornography. I shared with her my history, things that had happened along the way, and as honest as I knew how to be, shared with her that part of my life. And she was, by God's grace and thankfully, just very naive in that whole area, very surprised, very caught off guard, not something we'd ever discussed, and yet was also very gracious. And I remember her in that conversation saying to me, well, why don't you just promise me that you'll never do those things again? A very fair question, a very fair request, and something that I was very eager to do. And yet I remember saying to her that night, I want to make that promise to you. And yet I feel like I've made that promise to God, myself, and others many times already, and it seems to keep sneaking back into my life. So I said, I'm going to try really hard, but I don't know if I can make that promise to you, because I didn't want to make an empty promise. And what is very unique as I think of my story now, looking back, is that even as a 21-year-old young man who believed I was marrying the woman of my dreams and I would do anything for her, I was acknowledging even then that this was a struggle I didn't know how to put an end to, even with my best attempts. But I was very blind to that then. I was in a lot of denial. I was minimizing it and thinking I wasn't under the pretense that marriage would fix my broken sexuality. As many of you have maybe discovered, marriage doesn't fix us. Marriage tends to reveal more of what's already there. And if we have a struggle going into marriage, marriage will tend to amplify it or change it. It won't fix it. So I didn't believe marriage was going to fix my issues with pornography. I just thought I was going to mature my way out of it. That I was sincere in my faith. I was sincere about feeling called to ministry. I was sincere about my desire not to continue it. And I just felt it would eventually go away. Well, as you probably know, it did not. And that's just not how it happens. I continued to struggle into our marriage and into being a pastor. And so because I'd opened that door in our dating relationship, I felt like I could come back to her on occasion and say, hey, I'm so sorry, I've messed up again. It happened, here's what occurred, but I'm so sorry, and here's why this is the last time. Here's why I've finally figured it out and it won't keep happening. And I would use my words to give her assurance that it was really gonna change. But unfortunately, I was also believing my own words, that this time was gonna be the last time and it wouldn't happen anymore. And every time she would be hurt and she would be angry. And what I didn't understand then is that that was all very normal and justifiable. What I was stuck in was this view of, hey, this has been in my life before I ever met you. It's not about you. It's a struggle I have. And if you just understood my struggle, you wouldn't be so upset. As you might imagine, that was not a great conversation to try to convince her of. So we went through this basically for the first 10 years of our marriage. And when I became a senior pastor at the age of 27, she was at that point the only safe person I had left to tell. Because I was now the guy at church. I needed to have it all together. I couldn't confide in friends or the elders who I previously had been able to share some of my struggle with. She was the only one I could tell. And by the way, if you're ever in that situation where you are the only one who knows your spouse's struggle, that is not a healthy situation for either of you. It's a burden too much for you to bear. It's not your responsibility to change them. And it's not going to be enough for them to find a pathway into freedom if they're only being honest with you. Now, it's a good step for couples to be honest with each other. But if that's as far as the honesty goes, it is unlikely that the situation will change, as we discovered. Because in 10 years of doing this and confiding in her and, hey, I'm so sorry, this is the last time, as you might expect, even the most gracious people in the world start to become a little jaded. And when I would say this is the last time, there wasn't a whole lot of belief on her side anymore that it was going to be the last time. And I saw a change taking place in her heart where I felt like she was beginning to close off towards me. I could just sense that something was changing, that the level of anger and hurt was getting to a place that we might not be able to recover from. And in 2010, I'd been away actually at seminary and I'd had another relapse. And it was in that moment I felt like God really gave me a gift. And it was a very unique gift, but it was the gift of seeing not my pain of having to tell her, but the gift of seeing her pain ahead of time. Why it took me 10 years to see her pain, I don't know. That maybe speaks a lot to my own selfishness and the things we may struggle with. But it was really the first time I think I was feeling not pain for myself, but I can't believe I have to hurt her by sharing this again. And was so frustrated and done myself that just like, I don't know how we can go on. So I shared with her, and as expected, it was very frustrating. She was very angry and said these words. She said, Nick, it's not that I hate you, but it's that I hate the way this makes me feel. And because I don't know if it will ever change, because you've promised for 10 years that it would change, I don't know if I can stay around this much pain. And she was talking about things like separation and going and staying with her parents, things like that elevated to me like, wow, this is a really serious situation. We need to do something about this. But we didn't know anywhere else to turn. I didn't know any other resources other than to do what I'd always done, which was to try harder to just avoid temptation in my life. To not have a smartphone, to not use the internet alone, to not watch TV alone, to not go to places like just not be anywhere alone ever where I could ever be tempted or triggered. And so we were 2 months into that journey, which I would call white knuckling it, just trying to hold on to the wheel and not crash again. I'd built this wall of guardrails and boundaries very high, but the problem was I knew that nothing on the inside had fundamentally changed. That I was only a moment away from being in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong opportunity, and I would act out again, and that terrified me because I really believed that if I did that again, my marriage was over. And yet I didn't know what else to do except continue in that. So we were 2 months into that journey when I was at a conference for pastors, and they had brought in Dr. Ted Roberts, who was the founder of Pure Desire Ministries. And he spoke to a room of about 300 pastors and talked about what healing really looked like. That it wasn't just about the behavior, but it was understanding all of the things under the surface that were driving our behaviors. And if we didn't deal with the deeper stuff, the pain in our life, the wounds that we were medicating, and this pattern of escaping life and escaping pain, the behaviors would keep happening. And all this was new information to me. And then our leaders got up and made an incredible offer. They said, if you're a pastor who struggles, and as long as it doesn't include anything illegal or physical contact with other people, if it's just the internet and lust and fantasy and masturbation, we have a pathway to healing and freedom, and we want to keep you in ministry and help you work through this to be healthy, not to be disqualified and fired. It was an amazing offer then. In fact, for most pastors, it would be an amazing offer today. It's not the norm in churches for leaders to say, we'd rather have you be healthy than have to fire you, and here's the pathway. It was like they had put the path together just for me. And you would think with this offer, I would have been running down the aisle that day singing, free at last, thank God Almighty, I can be free at last. You would think that, but you would be wrong. Because I was so stuck in denial and minimizing that I sat there with my arms folded, looking around this room of about 300 pastors thinking, I hope the men who really struggle are listening to this, because this sounds like a great offer for them. And that's the nature, I think, of our struggles. When any of us struggle, we think the people who really need help are the people who are one step beyond where we're at. Well, they have it really bad. They should get help, but I've got this figured out. I'd had 2 good months. Like, yeah, I think we're doing it. And so I was ready to pass on the offer because it wasn't for me. It was too much work, too much time, too much money. But thankfully, I was not at that conference alone. I can't even remember why, but for some reason, that conference, my wife had been able to take off work. We had found a sitter for 3 days for our kids, and we were at the conference together. And she's sitting there hearing the same offer, and what she is hearing is an answer to 10 years of her prayers. Because for 10 years, she had prayed that God would lead us to a pathway that would create healing and freedom, because she believed I wanted it, but we didn't know what to do. And so as she's sitting there, her eyes are getting big, and she's just so filled with hope. And I look over at her, and I see all that happening. It's like, oh, I think I'm going to get to go meet Dr. Ted Roberts and find out about this pure desire thing. So before I did that, the first step they offered was, hey, here's a counselor in our district, a man I already knew. They said, go talk with him and see if the Pure Desire program would benefit you. So I went and I sat with him, and I probably spent half an hour sharing my story and telling him why I didn't need the TED program, as I called it. It was too long. It took a whole year, all this money. I'm like, we don't need that. I said, I just need a couple of tips. I think I'm almost free. And he said, okay, Nick, let me ask you a question. 3 questions. He said, number 1, how long has this been a problem? I said, well, since my early teen years, so we're going on 15, 17 years at this point that I've struggled with this. He said, okay, second question, how many times have you tried to stop? And I actually laughed because I said, well, every time was going to be the last time. I've tried to stop hundreds, if not thousands of times unsuccessfully over those many years. He said, okay, third question, is it causing you or people you love significant pain? And I said, well, yeah, I think if I act out again, I'm going to lose my marriage. And he said, okay, Nick, let's put these 3 answers together. It's been a problem for a long time. You've tried repeatedly to change without success, even though it's causing you and people you love significant pain. And I said, well, yeah, that's a pretty good description of my life right there. And that's where he leaned across and said to me words that I needed to hear, but had never heard before. He said, Nick, that's the clinical definition of an addiction. And I remember I sat back like he had just slapped me, because it was like, it did not compute in this brain of like, how could I sincerely love God. I sincerely feel called to be a pastor. I'm not trying to live a double secret life. I want to do the right thing. And yeah, I struggle once in a while. And in my brain, you couldn't both love Jesus and be addicted to something. Those were mutually incompatible. But for the first time today, I began to put together that I had allowed a behavior in my life to grow to the place where it was beyond my ability to manage it. And that's what we call an addiction. But what it also meant is that the pathway to recovery was a lot more serious than I'd ever expected. That it wasn't just trying harder or learning a few new tips, but it was really walking through this process of change. And so that meant for both Michelle and I entering into a 1-year program of counseling with Pure Desire, where she had a counselor that met with her, I had a counselor that met with me, and we got to do a lot of stuff together to talk through the hurt this had caused in our marriage, the trust issues, and how to navigate changing the behavior, not just stopping it, but making long-term change. It also meant that we were both in groups. We would drive half an hour to another church that had these groups. I would be in a group for men that were struggling. My wife would be in the group for women who felt betrayed. And for the first time, we both had a safe place to process what we were feeling, what was going on, and what did real change and freedom look like. And that year for us became transformational because it took us from what I would say just kind of that cohabiting of, we were good roommates, we navigated life well together, we shared the kids well, we were creating a home, but really connecting was something we hadn't really known how to do. And through that process, as we got in touch with our stories and what were the issues that were driving, my behavior, but also for my wife, what was the enemy using in my story to make her believe she wasn't good enough or that it was her fault, and how did that connect to her pain and to her past? And as it surfaced, all these conversations, we began to get to know one another in ways that we never had. There were many, many nights we stayed up late after we'd put our kids in bed, just talking and processing and discovering I'd never realized that this is driving my behavior. I hadn't understood that about your story, and really connecting for the first time. And so it was successful in changing the addiction and the behavior, but it also created marriage connection and what I would say for today, a joy in our relationship that we hadn't had before. And I think there are 5 takeaways from our story that are still to this day a part of how we're cultivating joy coming out of our story that might be helpful for you to think about whether you've got a struggle, an addiction that you're working through in your marriage or not. I think these are principles that all of us could be applying and working out in our relationship. So the first one I would discuss or have you think about with me to cultivate joy in your marriage is to look for past pain underneath your current triggers. Look for the past pain that is underneath your current triggers. What I mean is, how many of you realize that what you're fighting about is usually not the real issue? Right? What you're fighting about is just what's triggered the real issue, and in that moment becomes the focal point. But if all we ever do is focus on the current trigger or what's causing the argument and never go deeper into some of the root issues, we'll just keep having the same arguments over and over and over, because the real thing that needs to be resolved is never getting addressed. So for example, in our marriage, I would really struggle with being very critical about my wife's spending, making her feel bad about how she used money, and guilting her a lot about that. And you could say, well, this was just all about the budget and that we needed to stick to a budget. And I think budgets in marriage are really, really wise. But I had to realize it wasn't actually about the money being spent. Because in my story, I grew up in a lower middle class family in rural Wyoming, and hand-me-downs and very few Christmas presents and a very small, simple home were just part of our life. My dad pastored a church of like 40 people, was never paid a whole lot. My mom worked just to make ends meet. And so that fear of not having enough money was now causing me to try to control my wife, really to navigate my own fear. It wasn't even about her, it was more about my fear. And until we could recognize that, till I could recognize that, I was going to continue to be critical of her spending out of my own fear. And so as I came to to be able to grasp that, it allowed us to kind of diffuse the conversation. Because we still have conversations about money, and like most marriages, there tends to be a spender and a saver, there tends to be a planner and a spontaneous one. I mean, we still can be at odds of, well, why'd you buy that, or why'd we spend this? But if you can diffuse the energy of the underneath pain that's driving it, now you can just have a normal conversation, like let's talk about our funds, versus when it's driven by fear, it would always be much, much more difficult to ever get to a place of resolution or being on the same page. So in whatever issues you find keep coming up in your marriage, I would encourage you to try to take time on your own or with a friend or even a counselor to just process what could be deeper pain or wounds that are driving the emotional reaction I have in this area. Now, that's not to say the thing you're fighting about doesn't matter. It's just saying there's probably something deeper creating all the emotional energy that gets you stuck in that same pattern. So look for the past pain under the current triggers. Number 2, I think to cultivate joy in our marriages, we have to practice gratitude. And I use the word practice very intentionally because it's not just saying thank you when someone, maybe does the dishes or picks up something, but it's an attitude of being grateful on the inside that I regularly return to. Because one of the things we learned about the human brain and how our brains function is that our brain will tend to find whatever it is that we're looking for. And so if we get stuck in a pattern in our relationship where I tend to see the faults or weaknesses or flaws in my spouse, I have the ability, without even trying to, my brain kind of reorganizes itself and it begins to pick up on every time that happens. And so if I think of my spouse as being, unthoughtful, let's say, or I think of them as being selfish, and that's kind of my focal point, I will find more and more reasons to back up what I'm believing about their selfishness or them being unthoughtful. And that's just true. That's how your brain works. Well, if that's true, the good news is you can also get it working for you. Because if every morning when you got up and thought about your spouse, you had 3 or 4 things you remember how grateful you are about them, like, man, they're really good with our kids, or they're a really consistent provider, or they're really steady in how they use our finances. Whatever it is in your marriage, even in a very, very difficult marriage, I guarantee you there are some positive things about your spouse. You could say, I'm grateful for this, I'm grateful for this, I'm grateful for this. And as you practice that, your brain will actually work for you, and you will begin to see more examples of what you're looking for in gratitude. And over time, this shapes you. One of the things I said to couples every time I would perform their marriage ceremonies is I would say, whether we intend to or not, we will often create the spouse that we have. Now, I'm not saying you're responsible for their choices or responsible for their bad behavior, but I'm saying if we have a relationship where we are continually nagging or critical or angry, we shouldn't be surprised if we have an angry, critical, defensive spouse. Because we tend to create in our relationships what's coming out of us. And so I think it's really important that if we can see, well, how could I work on me? How could I change what I'm looking for in my spouse to instead see the good, to see the hopeful, to see what is positive and build on that? If I start to create a hopeful, positive, joyful relationship, I may see that my spouse is more of those things as well. Because we tend to create outside of us what we're feeling inside of us. So practice gratitude. The third principle that we learned that's been so important for us is the need to make space for emotional connection. Make space for emotional connection. I think that's what I was sharing, that we had become very good partners. We were good at navigating kids and doctor's appointments and bills and, taking care of the house and the lawn and the yard, all that. Like, we were good at that, but we weren't good at really talking, really connecting. And I think our counseling journey really taught us some language of how to go below the surface and not just talk about the what and the who and who needs to be where and when, but to talk more about the how we're feeling, how we're really doing, how we're processing something, and to connect around our feelings, our fears, our hopes, and our dreams. One of the tools that we used that some of you may know if you've entered into the Genesis process, which is awesome that here at Good Shepherd we have Genesis process groups for men and for women. A tool the Genesis process teaches you to use is called the FASTER scale. And the FASTER scale, which you could find online, there's now apps that do the FASTER scale. You don't have to be an addict or a struggler to use the FASTER scale. I think every human being on the world, in the planet could use it. It's an emotional awareness scale that when we go to a place we don't want to go, which you could call a relapse, and if you don't have an addictive thing you're working through, a relapse might be when I lose my temper and I blow up and I yell at my kids, that feels like I'm going back to a place I've promised I don't want to go back to. Well, what are the steps that took to get there? FASTER is a scale that helps you understand the steps you're taking. F is forgetting priorities, A is anxiety, S is speeding up, T is ticked off, E is exhausted, R is relapse. And that was something I was required to do in the group I was in. And so for us to connect as a married couple, once a week, we would just sit down after the kids were in bed, and I would talk through my FASTER scale. On the one hand, it helped my wife know was I relapsing or not, because if I had, I'd have to go to share the bottom of the scale. And thankfully that didn't happen. But it opened up parts of my life I had never known how to talk about. because I had to answer questions like, how did this make you feel? Why did you do this? What was the benefit for you? How did it impact the important people in your life? And as I began to share those parts of my story, my wife felt the freedom to do the same thing, and we really connected at a deeper level. A much simpler tool that others have used or that you could find is called the Fanos check-in. I don't know if anyone's ever used the Fanos check-in. It's Fanos, Fanos. You can find this online too. It's really simple, and it's meant to be like a 5-minute check-in. That each of you take a couple of minutes in a check-in, it could be right before bed or first thing in the morning, to share something you're feeling, an affirmation or appreciation you have for the other person, a current need, a need that you have, taking ownership for something that you've done or said or that you just need to own. Hey, I need to own I didn't do well in this situation. Ownership, and then a struggle or how you're doing in your sobriety. So in 2 minutes to just share, here's something I'm feeling, here's something I appreciate, here's a need that I have, here's something I need to take ownership of, and here's an area of struggle. That creates deeper connection beyond what time's the t-ball game and who's picking up groceries and what's for dinner. And I think in our marriage relationships, sometimes that's all we talk about and realize it's been weeks since we've talked about anything but just the kids and the schedules and budgets. So Fanos, the faster scale, things like that to go to an emotional level of connection. The fourth area for cultivating joy that I think is absolutely crucial in a marriage is to focus on mutual pleasure in the bedroom. I know when we talk about sex, it's a complicated topic and I don't have a lot of time, but in just a few minutes, I would like to say that church culture in particular, and I think our broader culture in general had taught me, and maybe has taught many of you and your spouses, that when it comes to sex, that sex is a need for him and optional for her. Like if it's good for her too, great, but it's really about him and having his needs met. And this is incredibly destructive in marriages. And really for the first 10 years, it's kind of how we operated. I hoped it was mutually beneficial, but at the end of the day, it was really about, was I getting what I felt I needed? And I think I was really blind to how significant this is intended to be a place of mutual pleasure and enjoyment. If there's any verse in the Bible that I think is more abused, it's the 1 Corinthians 7 passage that talks about not depriving one another. Because it's almost exclusively used to say that women should not deprive men of sex in marriage. Which, if you read the whole chapter, what's really interesting is Paul is writing this chapter to both people equally. And if it's only benefiting one person and not the other, then it's been misinterpreted. I would put it that way. And just say if that's being used in your life or in your past, you're thinking to say, well, this is just my job as a wife, just my duty to provide, it's not helping either of you. I've become a big fan of a gal named Sheila Ray Gregoire. Some of you maybe know her name. She wrote a book called The Great Sex Rescue, or she has a brand new book coming out called She Deserves Better. She said this in her book. They did a survey of 20,000 women. And they said, our survey definitively showed that having sex out of obligation when you feel forced to do so is never a wonderful thing to do. It robs her of the joy she was meant to experience, and it robs him of the marriage in which he is desired, not just placated. And if this is an area in your marriage at all of struggle where there is not an equality of, hey, we're both looking for the mutual pleasure of the other person, I would highly, highly recommend Sheila Ray's books, and particularly the one quoted here, The Great Sex Rescue, because she just does a phenomenal job of challenging and I would say destroying that paradigm that has been created, that it's his need and kind of optional for her. It's like, no, God made us all to be sexual beings. And the idea that it's a need for him is really more often than not because of the struggles that young men have in teenage years, and now even younger in our culture, that trains them to think I do need this all the time. But it is no more a need for him than it is for her. Because as a good friend of mine at Pure Desire says, if he doesn't have sex, he won't die. It's true, he won't die. And so it's not a need, it's a desire. And we've confused need and desire. And we need to come back to a place where that desire can be mutually beneficial, mutually enjoyable. And we've just seen incredible growth in our marriage in this area as I continue to learn how to change that paradigm and make sure it's about us and not me. And I know some of you are thinking, well, it's really my husband that needs to hear this. Just send him my way, send him to Pure Desire, we'll talk and try to help him as well. Or you buy the book and you just kind of conveniently bring up like, hey, I think this book would really help us. Because what you can say is, I think if we followed the principles of this book, we would have better sex. And every husband I know is going to say yes to that. Like, oh, okay. But he might be surprised how much it's going to challenge him to change his ways of thinking in order to have better connection in the marriage. All right, the last one, and then I'll wrap up. For cultivating joy in marriage is to rekindle your magic moments. Rekindle your magic moments. And what I mean by that, magic moments, is what are those things, what are those characteristics, what are those traits, what are those things that happened early in your marriage that caused you to fall in love? Because research has found something very, very fascinating. This is in Dr. Ted Roberts' book, but he's not the author of the quote. It's Dr. Luis Cozolino, who's a brain scientist expert. So it says, research done by Dr. Luis Cozolino shows that original feelings between spouses change very little over time. And they did this research that even with couples in deep, deep pain and disagreement and dysfunction, when they would go back to their how did you meet stories and tell us about your dating and what made you fall in love, that those feelings were still there. And what I think happens is the further we get from those moments and we have kids and bills and mortgages and disagreements, our focus gets so on those things that we forget what we love about each other. That's why for my wife and I, a regular date night is an absolute priority. Not just because we love to eat good food and find good restaurants, which we do, but because in those moments when we're not around the house or the kids or the property or all the stuff, and it's just us, and we can remember, oh yeah, I really like you. There's things about you that made me fall in love with you, and I'm still in love with you for those same things, but if I don't remember them, if I don't call them to mind, over time we forget. And when we forget, then we get focused on all the wrong stuff. And so I would just encourage you to think through what would that look like for you to cultivate those moments where you can remember why we fell in love, why we had so much fun. And if a date night isn't possible, it might be just a walk. It might be a time for you to journal and remember, like, why did I fall in love with this guy? And to discover that, oh, a lot of those feelings are still there. We just have to rekindle those moments. And I don't mean you have to go back and do that date again. Or I mean, if you do, that's wonderful and creative. But what I mean is more to keep in mind, to keep in your thoughts and your emotions. This is what I love about him and our relationship, and the way that becomes glue in your marriage really is a source of great joy for us. So those are the pieces from me. I'll hand it back over to Maddie and the team. I know you've got other pieces, and then around 11 o'clock or a little after, my wife Michelle will be here. You'll get to hear from her, and then some Q&A time from both of us.
Thanks. Okay, that was wonderful. Thank you, Nick. We're going to go ahead and take a 10-minute break. This morning looks a little different. So here's the text in question. Elle just went from teaching. She's coming in. She's going back to teaching. So thank you for skipping your lunch break to be with us. You're welcome. Okay.
I get to sit down? That never happens. Okay. Well, I'm sure you all enjoyed my husband speaking this morning. I can't get this chair to not slide. I'm actually really sad to miss it because I love hearing him speak. I'm sure everything he said was 100% accurate. I know, I won't know. You'll have to tell me later. Seriously though, we don't have a perfect marriage, and we have our ups and downs, but we do have a good one. Rocking, 23 years? And I think our ability to have fun with each other is really key to this. As Nick shared in our story, we had some real hurt to work through with his addiction to pornography. That was hard and painful, but it also created a connection between us that we never had before. I thought we had great communication, and then we went through Pure Desire, and I was like, oh, we weren't actually that good at it. We spent more nights talking long after the kids were in bed about our fears, our hopes, our dreams, and we actually really connected on an emotional level in ways we hadn't in the first 10 years of our marriage. I wouldn't wish this circumstance on anyone, but I would say that if you're going through something hard, look for how God can use it to bring good and growth in your marriage. Sorry, I'm a little nervous. Not only did our process help us connect emotionally as a couple, it also helped me face some of the life hurts that were hindering my ability to be the best wife I could. Nick wasn't the only one with triggers from his past. I had triggers and anger around my pain from my family of origin, which I learned. And that would make disagreements with Nick so much harder to work out because I was being triggered by multiple sources. When a counselor was able to help me see the wounds and identify the false beliefs I had about myself and about relationships, this made it possible for me to communicate my needs more openly in my marriage. Don't get me wrong, when I feel hurt or misunderstood, I still try to stuff it, clam up, avoid, wait till the next day, it'll all go away, right? But I've learned to look inside, try to identify what am I feeling, and take ownership of what part am I playing in this, and then communicate that to Nick. And this has made the world of difference in our relationship. I kind of didn't have a voice before Pure Desire. And when Nick said we like to date and have fun, this is very true. When you have 4 kids, full-time jobs, right now 3 kids in spring sports, it's a little crazy. You can forget how much you like each other. Your world can revolve around your kids or your job, and you kind of forget about each other. But when we just go to hang out, the 2 of us, we leave that all behind, and I start to remember all the reasons we fell in love. I think that keeps our marriage filled with joy. And so if you're not taking time to date your spouse, I know it's hard with little kids, but we made it a priority our whole marriage, even in the first 10 years of the crazy. Little kids, we always found a way to find someone to watch our babies and go out and date each other. So make it a priority. It's been a game changer, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Everything I say is 100% accurate. Now, it may not seem directly related, but Mom to Mom team asked if we could also share thoughts on how to talk to your kids about sex. Never an easy topic, and you might be wondering how this relates to cultivating joy in marriage. Well, the truth is, our recovery journey over Nick's addiction not only rekindled our joy in our marriage, but it also gave us new tools and insights into how to create a healthy environment in our home, so that our kids didn't fall, and all kids, no. Our kids didn't fall into the same traps that Nick had as a kid. So I'm going to talk about 4 ways that we've grown in this area, and then we can open it up for questions. So first, the first key to working on creating a culture of grace in your home around the topic of sex and pornography. In most Christian homes, like the ones Nick and I grew up in, no one ever talked about sex except to say it's wrong and it's sinful outside of marriage. But this lack of communication made sex a taboo topic. And when children grow up in a home like this, it teaches them not to talk. And so if they do happen upon something or see something at school or hear something about sex and they don't understand, they usually won't bring it up. They may even think mom and dad aren't safe to bring this up with. That's why it's so key to communicate in a healthy, open way about sex, and to encourage your children in age-appropriate ways that they can talk to you. It might be as simple as asking them, are you hearing anything at school about sex or the body that you don't understand? What do kids joke about in your classroom? And when they say nothing, because they usually will, follow it up by saying, well, if anything ever comes up, you know you can talk to me. I won't be mad or upset. If you have questions or need to share something, I always want you to be able to talk to us. I'm here to help. It's amazing when we do this. At a later time, our kids will usually bring this up. Typically, we take a lot of long road trips, so usually a long road trip or taking a kid to their practice, they'll bring it up. Or sometimes we'll go into the hot tub late at night, and that usually ends up in a question from our kids, like, hey, this came up today at school. So keep that conversation with them just constantly going. Second key, which is to find opportunities to talk and teach. If we only talk about sexual things when our kids make a wrong choice, we inadvertently shame and punish them, reinforcing that sex isn't safe to talk about. We can't wait until our kids are 12 and 13 and then have the talk. We need to be having mini talks all the time from ages as small as 3 and 4 about the body, the differences between your genders, how the body works, how the world thinks versus how God's word talks about it. If we can find opportunities to bring this up in normal conversations, our kids will take our cues from us. They will be able to understand that God made them in the way they are, and that their body, even sexually, isn't dirty or sinful. God made their body good, but there are bad ways the world encourages us to use them. One example of this is having turned off a show or turned our eyes away from inappropriate commercials. That's something we've taught the boys at a young age. And we try to teach this as a teachable moment and talk about why do we do that. Not just because it's bad, but because of how these images can shape our brains and make it difficult to have the kind of future marriage he wants from us. These have been good, short conversations with our kids. And the older they get, the more they know about our story. We use our story in these conversations with the kids. And there was one time I was sitting this way, and the TV was behind me, and both boys were like, and I was like, what? What was up there? It was like, some random commercial, but I was like, good job, boys. And that was when they were pretty young. And then third, if we're going to look for opportunities to teach and train our kids, not shame and punish them, then we have to be ready for these moments. This could literally mean that we need to stand in front of the mirror and watch ourselves say words like sex, masturbation, pornography, because if we can't say these words without getting embarrassed or acting weird, neither will our kids. Remember, they take cues from us. This was one of the many benefits of going through Pure Desire for me. I didn't have an addiction, but in talking with other women about Nick's struggles, it made me more comfortable with the topic of sexuality and being able to bring it up with my children. This doesn't mean our kids are perfect, or we're perfect, but I was able to bring my experience into my parenting. And so if you've never done a deep dive into your issues or struggles and would have a hard time knowing how to talk about it, I want to encourage you to experience the group experience. And I know that Echo Shepherd, they have Betrayal and Beyond groups for women who are hurt by their husband's struggle. They have Genesis Process groups for women who want to understand their own behaviors. And both of these environments would be great places to practice your communication. I've done them both. They're both amazing. Or you could watch a video series put out by Pure Desire called Sexual Integrity 101. I hear the presenters are pretty good. It's my friend Ashley. Oh yeah, Nick's on there too. And last, number 4, the last key to talking with your kids about sex, and that's an encouragement to get healthy yourself. The truth is, we won't be able to pass on to our kids something we haven't experienced ourselves. And I know that that's a block for many adults. We can talk all day about how dangerous the internet is or how to avoid sex until marriage, but if we're not modeling a life of self-awareness and health, our talk won't go very far. They'll be able to see through us. We have to be able to own and identify our own story, good and bad, before we can truly help our kids write their own stories. If you've never faced your negative history, whether it's the choices you've made or the choices made against you, a group experience, like I mentioned, is really key. Even if your husband's struggling with something and isn't ready to deal with it himself, you will get support and work on your own health, and it will impact your kids. I know many women in groups that I've led whose husbands aren't ready to deal with their stuff, and they just get healthy themselves, and it's key. And I'm not a perfect mom, I'm not a perfect person by any means, but I do know Pure Desire groups are amazing, and I was in them, and I've led them, and they've helped shape me and understand my past, work through issues in our marriage, and become a more emotionally healthy person. As I do this, even imperfectly, it makes me a better mom for my kids, and a better wife for my husband, hopefully a better person overall, better friend. And I know it will do the same for you. I'm all done.
Yeah, good. Well, we've had a number of really good questions come in to open up. Maybe one on the dating side that I thought was really good because we both mentioned the dates. Someone asked, I love the idea of a weekly date. We shoot for once or twice a month but have 2 littles. 2 questions. What season did you find you needed the regular date nights the most? And what seasons were the hardest to have regular date nights? Any thoughts on that? When did we need it most, and when has it been the hardest?
We always need it.
That's what I was going to say. think it's always needed.
Every stage of your life changes. Like babies are hard, teenagers are harder. I think he can tell when I'm getting a little crabby. And he's like, hey, let's go on a date. Or if I'm not communicating as much. So kind of reading your partner too, if you have a few weeks where you're not going out, and then make it a priority is one thing.
Yeah, I think with the age of our kids now is probably the hardest season to go out because, even this weekend, our normal date night, we're at a swim meet. It's like, well, let's go Saturday. Well, we're probably going to be at a baseball game. For another kid, it's like, oh, let's go Sunday. Well, now Sunday's the night before school. And it is harder to navigate schedules, so we're having to be more creative. But I think when our kids were little, you've got the pressure of little kids, but I felt like as long as we could find a babysitter, we could go out. Or to swap with another couple, alternate weeks, or other things we did when our kids were real little was even just saying like, hey, such and such night is our date night. And usually our kids were in bed at 8 o'clock. And what that would help us remember is like, okay, I'm not going to be working on laundry. I'm not going to have emails. I'm not going to be watching TV. Like, we're going to get the kids in bed. We're going to make, decaf lattes, and we're just going to sit on the couch and talk or go through, a lesson that we did in our groups. And kind of clearing the space. So like, it's not just us sitting on the couch watching a movie. You can watch movies anytime. That's great too. But to clear away, like that would be the date night that week. If we didn't have the money or time to get out, it's just Thursday night. It's just going to be us connecting. And I think that when our kids were real little and funds were tight, that was effective some weeks too.
I don't know what he said about dating earlier, but one time he pre-picked questions and put them in his wallet, like really teeny tiny. So he started asking me all these great questions, and I was like, that's a good question. I felt so connected. So just a little tip, you could pre-plan your questions on your dates because we like communication. Women like communication.
That was actually a question. Someone said date night questions to help connect on those weekly date nights. So I got those. Les and Leslie Parrott have a great little book. It's probably on Amazon still, called Love Talk Starters that you could pick up, and it's got, is that what it's called? Or I think there's also 101 questions.
There's some apps online.
Yeah, so Les and Leslie Parrott are a great resource for questions. And there's also, you've maybe heard the name John Gottman is a marriage expert. He's not Christian, so some of the questions you might filter out differently. But he's got an app called Love Decks or Love Cards. It's a free app. So if you just looked up John Gottman, Love Decks, and there's 6 different categories you could just open up, and it has hundreds of questions. And we've done that on a date night. I'll just open one up and we'll just start going through. And if you think one's a dumb question, just skip it. But it gives you a lot of prompts and ideas there. So.
Because without this help, sometimes we're like, how was your day? What are the kids doing? I don't know. It's not as fun.
Yeah. Well, and you're just tired. You're like, I don't know what to ask you. What should we talk about? And so those questions can really help. Here's one on the Pure Desire side. What kind of resources does Pure Desire have for women who are struggling with porn addiction? We have a group resource called Unraveled. And Unraveled groups, there have been some here at Good Shepherd. You could find on the Pure Desire website if there's any groups meeting locally. We also have online groups. Or I would also say the Genesis process that's happening here at Good Shepherd. What's great about the Genesis process, any struggle you have, at the beginning in the first lesson, you identify what's something in my life I wish would change. And you could have 8 women addressing 8 different issues, and Genesis process could be helpful for that too. So it's not specifically about sexuality, but Genesis process and Pure Desire groups are built on a lot of the same principles that combine the Bible and the brain and what change looks like into a really effective process. So either Unraveled from Pure Desire or the Genesis process would both be good. A couple more. Would Pure Desire be beneficial for couples not struggling through an addiction, but recovering from an affair? I would say absolutely, because even if the affair partner says, well, I'm not looking at pornography regularly, what I would say, affairs never just happen. Affairs are always a part of someone's unhealthy thinking, lies they believe, ways they're dealing with unwanted pain or emotions in their life, and the affair becomes the byproduct. And the group, this is what so surprised me when we started Pure Desire groups the first time, because I thought, what on earth are we going to talk about for 2 hours? Because my experience was you show up and you ask, well, did you look at porn this week? And if you said no, everyone said great job. And if you said yes, everyone prayed for you, and then the group was over. So I'm like, well, what could we possibly be talking about? And then you find out like, oh, it's all this other stuff. It's the faster scale. It's let's talk about your past wounds and what you learned from your family of origin and your parents. And let's talk about the lies that you believe. And all these questions that I'd never thought about. And if the issue is affairs, there's a whole spectrum of sexual brokenness or unhealthy material or behaviors. And I'd say, yes, a pure desire group can be really helpful. So that's why we try to say the groups are for any kind of unwanted sexual behavior. Affairs, lust, pornography, and everything in between, it'd be very worthwhile.
Yeah, I've had women in my groups that their husbands struggled with pornography, their husbands have had affairs. So one thing I realized was we all feel the same way. Whether your husband struggles with pornography or they're having an affair, it creates the same emotions to a woman. So.
Yeah. Okay, back to a parenting question. This is a parenting question. They said that. I am a mom of 2 boys, ages 5 and 7. And we have 2 girls, 2 boys, if you saw our picture. Recently, we have been having a lot of issues with bathroom talk. And as a woman, I don't know how to handle it. My boys think butts are funny, and so they will start talking about butts and then laugh. My husband thinks it's funny too. And people in my circle will say, well, boys will be boys. What are your thoughts on this? As a mom, I want to set up healthy boundaries, and I'm afraid that the boys will be boys mindset is setting up my boys for failure and future problems. Any thoughts on that one?
You start.
I'll talk about like the boys will be boys. I think there's 2 sides to it, that there is some truth that our boys, when they're little, find farts funny and girls didn't. And our boys found a lot of body humor funny, and our girls just were never into that. And so some of it is brain wiring and natural human chemistry. Like, boys are different. And I think we have to remember not everything like that is wrong. Not every sexual thought is wrong. God made brains to have sexual thoughts and ideas. So anytime something that we feel is maybe questionable happens, I don't think we need to jump in and stop like, oh, this is wrong, because there is a side of boys' brains are different and they find different things funny. It's like, okay, but there is another side where I think our society has normalized boys will be boys means, oh, they can look at porn or they can sleep around, or well, that's just boys being boys. And it's like, well, no, that's very unhealthy. It's normalizing things that we shouldn't normalize. And so I think in what you've described in this question, I wouldn't be too worried. Like, and if dad's in there with them and they're laughing about stuff that you think is just dumb, all right, just, step away and let them do their thing. But when it's starting to, if it's verging into they're commenting on other people's butts and being really negative or making fun of someone, or it's starting to become sexualized of how hot, or, I don't know, at 7, sometimes boys at 7 too are saying things that they don't even know what they're saying, but they've heard it or it came up on a video and now they're repeating it. And sometimes I think they're doing that to kind of test the waters and see how will mom and dad react. And if mom and dad flip out, it may cause them to think, oh, mom and dad, what Michelle was saying, mom and dad aren't safe. If there's anything sexual that comes up, I just won't bring it up at home. So I think if they maybe say something that's in this category and you're like, where did they hear that? That's a great place to start with just the curiosity of, oh, that's really interesting, buddy. Where did you hear about that? Or what made you think that? Or where did that come from? And they might say, oh, there's this YouTuber I watch. And that would be a better issue to address, is like, hey, maybe let's check out if this YouTuber is appropriate for you to be watching, because that sounds like content that's not appropriate for kids. That kind of like, be curious about where they're hearing stuff and don't just assume they're saying it because they have a dirty little brain. Because that's what I've been encouraged by my boys is I think kids' brains are actually wired to be pure, to stay naive and to not naturally just hunger for all this sexual stuff in our culture. Culture throws it at them, but I think if we're wise and help our kids navigate it, what I'm seeing in my boys, they're prone to not really want that because we're answering the questions at home. So that's a whole lot about boys and curiosity, and boys will be boys.
I don't know if this relates, but I do have a friend that works for Pure Desire, Ashley. She's amazing. And she once shared a story, which I don't think she'd care if I shared because she shared it from the platform before. But her daughter and her daughter's friend or her niece or something were looking at their body parts. And like the older brother was like, Mom, you got to go in there. And at first she was like, what are they doing? And she just was like, so why were you doing that? And just asked some questions, and they were super innocent, like, well, hers looks different than mine, and so we were just wondering. And it was totally innocent, but then they continued to have a conversation about, when it's appropriate to look at other people's parts, and there was no shame. And I just thought that was a really good story.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Kids are curious, and if we recognize curiosity is normal, not sinful, then we can help them navigate the curiosity, and actually it answers it. Where I think in a lot of Christian homes we get kind of freaked out and we're like, what were you thinking? Never do that. And now they have shame about their body, they have shame about other people and nakedness. Like, whoa, it becomes this whole thing where I think as parents, the more we can normalize, talk about how God made us, just have open conversations, then our kids are like, oh, well, that's cool. And their brain moves on. When we make a thing of it, their brain makes a thing of it and goes, wow, there's something here that mom is really worried about. And then their curiosity almost goes into overdrive. So keep that in mind.
Yeah, and one more thing, like the boys will sometimes ask me, especially when a littler, and they'll ask me a question, and I don't have boy parts, so I don't always know all the answers. And I was like, that's a great question, but I don't have that part, so could you ask your dad? Because I don't know why that does that. I don't know why. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's great.
But I think it's great that they feel comfortable to talk to me or to Nick. Like, it's not just, one or the other.
And I think especially pre-puberty, if both parents are involved in the conversations, it even more normalizes. Now, once they're getting older, it's probably better that a girl can go to her mom and a boy can come to his dad. And if there's not a dad in the picture, having other family members or men you really trust of like, hey, here's a guy that he has that level of relationship, he can ask questions. But as little kids, I think if they're both involved, it actually shows some health of, oh, mom and dad are both safe people. So encourage that. Here is a good question, which was the one I was going to ask. How do you know, what are some signs that your partner is struggling with pornography? And obviously I would confess, when I would confess you would know, but are there other things in our story or from your groups that have become kind of like red flags?
If they start to isolate from you or the family, that can be a sign, because they're trying to avoid being honest with you. I think sometimes in my groups, there could be like anger, or some of the husbands would like blame shift, like try to pick a fight so that they feel better. I don't know. I'm blanking.
Yeah. I think when a spouse is feeling pressured to do certain things in the bedroom and they're like, where did this come from?
Yeah.
This doesn't seem like usual for us. When there's phones, laptops, or TVs that are quickly being turned off or changed or hidden when someone comes in the room, I've had guys that when they're struggling, they try to defend it as privacy, but really they're trying to protect a secret. And I feel like in marriage, like the goal is to have no secrets. And I would approach it, if you're the spouse that is concerned, are they looking, rather than coming with an accusatory, I know you are, to come with more of an open, like, hey, I want us to have a trusting relationship. And when I come in the room and you hide your phone, it's hard for me to feel like there's not something that you're withholding from me. And so can we talk about this? Can we talk about what's going on? Because I want to build trust. So, I think those are a couple things.
I think it's a good rule just to not bring your phones or devices into the restroom. Make that like a family rule.
Yeah, and thinking too, what am I comfortable having my teenage son do? If I had a teenage son one day, then I shouldn't be doing it as the parent, and my husband shouldn't be doing it either. Because if we're like, hey, I don't want you taking your device into the bathroom, but they're like, well, you do. Like, oh, okay, that's true. A little double standard. So just creating healthy guidelines as a family that everyone follows can be really useful. How can we overcome feeling betrayed for whatever secret addictions weren't shared before marriage, but then were openly shared years after? Any thoughts on that?
Nick had a problem oversharing, so I knew most of everything. Honestly, I think maybe doing one of the groups would help you with that.
Yeah, I think that feeling of why didn't you tell me this earlier is natural and is a normal feeling. Like that's what I would just encourage you with, is to say, don't beat yourself up over feeling like, why was he hiding this, or why didn't we talk about this? And yes, I think there may be things there that have to be grieved or that were lost. You might feel like we've lost a lot of health in our marriage because you weren't honest earlier. And so you might have to grieve, but then there is a need to come to the present moment and say, okay, if this is our reality, I mean, I think that was a huge part of the journey for Michelle in groups, was like accepting this is the reality of our marriage and grieving what was lost, but saying, how do we write a new story? How do we start to change and move forward? And starting to focus on what that might look like can be helpful. So there are two sides of, there are things to be grieved and to be lost, but then there's also steps that you can take together.
And I think knowing what I knew before marriage and then his addiction after, like, I did know some things, so even if I think even if you didn't, like, it's still going to create the same emotions, and so you do need to process that in a healthy way and know all of that. But I don't know that it seems like if I would have known, maybe I would have done something differently. But I knew, and I told myself all the lies, like, well, once we have sex, it'll be different, or, all these things, like, even knowing, I don't know that it would have changed how I felt.
Yeah, it's gonna be hard to hear about whenever you hear about it. And it just changes maybe how you'll have to deal with it. This is a unique question that says, an 8-year-old boy has discovered the pressure of rubbing his private feels good. How do you address this? What do I say to him? What does the Bible say about this? Is this okay? When and where? So a couple of initial thoughts on that. An 8-year-old boy, again, going back to that curiosity, and God has made boys' brains a certain way. I think the starting point is always to try to ground their body and their sexual feelings in God's goodness and in his creation. So one of the first things to say is, isn't that amazing God made your body that way? God made that part of our body to experience and feel pleasure. And then you can use it as one of those teaching opportunities to say, this is what God made for a mommy and a daddy when they're married to experience together. And to talk about, the more we do this outside of marriage, it may actually make it more difficult to experience the joy or pleasure in marriage that God designed. And so we want to try to be wise about how we use that part of our body. Because I think if a kid who's just curious and found this out doesn't get a shame message, but instead gets some training and some understanding, like, oh, I think it is something we can learn. And there was another question asked about masturbation. Like, I think that's a whole area the church just hasn't done enough work to help people believe that it is possible to live without masturbation, but it is also not like an unforgivable sin, especially when we're in childhood, teenage years, and all these things about understanding our body and figuring out, like, hey, if it happens, it happened. But let's talk about, what is health? Why did God make us that way? How do we use our sexuality in a way that honors God and prepares us for healthy marriages? Versus for so many of us, if we discovered masturbation as a kid or a teenager, it was just not talked about. And so then by the time we're married, if we've had 10 years of that pattern, we've kind of trained ourselves for a manner of acting out sexually that's all about us and our pleasure and selfishness, and not being aware that, oh, this is actually meant to be used for mutual enjoyment. So I think at 8 years old, it is just focusing on, God made you that way. God made your body to do that. And let's talk about why God would have made our bodies to do that and how incredible his creation is. So, some thoughts on that. Anything to add to that one? Okay, another one here. Any tips on language to use with kids around personal privacy, appropriate or inappropriate behavior or pictures that don't add shame or embarrassment to the conversation, but also don't make things too casual? I don't want my kids to talk too freely about body parts, inappropriate behavior, etc., to just anyone or in just any environment, right?
I don't know if this is answering it, but a lot of times when the girls are a lot older now, so the boys have more questions lately, and I drive around with them a lot. So when they bring something up and we have a conversation, I'm like, or if they ask me something like they heard at school, I'll say, well, we'll have our conversation. And I said, and that's my job for you and I to have, but you need to let their parents share that with them.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. I think for parents, it's really helpful that we call things what they are, that we use the names of body parts, and it might feel weird to us to say penis and vagina, but those are body parts. And if they're only hearing slang or derogatory terms, it's good for them to know what that actually is. I mean, a funny part of my story, I hope no one's offended, but I was in 6th grade and I didn't know what the word ass meant because my family was so conservative. Like, that was a naughty word, and I knew it had something to do with the body, and I should never say it. But because I never even asked, like, oh, let's just learn this is what the body is. And that would have helped me in a lot of other conversations to go, oh, I know what that is. I know what they're talking about, and I also know why that's maybe not healthy. Because I think that's what we're trying to train our kids. Like, I think as parents, we're concerned about oversharing or like, well, what if I tell them too much too soon? And my observation would be if your desire is to help train your kids, I don't think you can tell them too much too soon. Because if they're not ready for it, if their brain's really not ready, it just kind of goes over their head. And they don't even sometimes hear what you've said. It's like, okay. But I would also much rather that like my children hear me use the words first and know what they mean than hear them at school. So to talk about the body and masturbation and pornography, and don't think that, boy, if I use the word pornography and tell them what it is, they're going to want to go look at it. Because I have found in a lot of conversations, actually the opposite happens, is now their brain knows what it is, knows what to call it, knows mom and dad are safe to talk to about it, and now their need to figure it out for themselves is so different. Because now they can come and say, hey, Dad, that thing we've talked about, pornography, someone at school was mentioning it, and their brother looks at it. What should I, because now they already kind of know, have a context. And what I've told a lot of parents is someone will build the framework for sexuality in your children's lives. It will either be you in your home or it will be our culture. And I would just say, let's be the ones that build the framework. Because then when they hear about it in culture, they already know what to do with it, what it means, and that mom and dad are safe people to talk to. Versus if it happens the opposite way and culture builds the framework, it's going to be unhealthy, and it's going to be a lot harder then to have the conversations at home. And so if your kids are older and today you're like, oh no, it's too late, I've already messed them up, it's never too late to start being open and honest. And maybe even a conversation to say, hey, I know we haven't talked much about this, but I just want you to know, if you have questions about your body or sex or what you hear at school, I'd love to talk and just be a part of helping you. And if even a moment like, oh, mom, or oh, that's embarrassing, they're still hearing it. They're still listening, and it's going to make an impact.
And I've noticed, so I have Luke who's in 5th grade, so he's still kind of young, and then Carter's a teenager now. And there's so much talking that can happen from birth to age 12. They talk way more, they can absorb more, they're more curious. And then they turn into teenagers and they don't talk anymore. And our boys are completely different boys already. Like Luke talks way more than Carter does. But developing those conversations when they're little before their brain is like, what's up? And they'd have nothing to share with you. Yeah. How was your day? Fine.
Yeah. Yeah, quick last example. Within the last year, our 11-year-old had heard somebody talking about 69 at school. And what Dad, what is 69? Well, if you actually start thinking about how do I describe this sexual act to a child? So it took me a while to come up with what I thought was age appropriate, but I said, hey, okay, this might sound weird to you, but here's what it is. And his face was like, And I was like, that's great, because that's how an 11-year-old should feel. Like, people do that? Like, huh. And but I could see since then, as it's come up or something got mentioned, to him it's not like, oh, I know what that is. My dad and I have talked about it. And when kids joke about it, I know why it's silly. Why are they like, that's silly. And it's just changed his brain. But if I'd have said, oh, we don't talk about that, his curiosity would have just been like, I gotta know. And so even those kind of things that you're like, what? This is such a weird one. If you just try in a very normal way to describe it as best you can, you actually help their brain know what to do with it, and you're setting them up for success. So just that happened in the last month or so with us. We are at the end of the time. Thank you, ladies. Here comes the mom-to-mom team to wrap us up.